October 1935. Harlem, New York City. A contract worth $50,000 more money than most men would see in a lifetime has been placed on the head of a single man. The target, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a 30-year-old enforcer whose reputation for both violence and loyalty has made him untouchable in the eyes of those who matter. The buyer, Arthur Dutch Schultz Flegenheimer, the most volatile gangster operating in Manhattan, a man whose policy racket empire spans $16 million annually, and whose temper has already claimed a dozen lives this year alone. The stakes are immediate and existential. Schultz wants control of Harlem's numbers game, the underground lottery that moves $40,000 through the neighborhood every single day. Johnson stands in his way, backed by the Italian mafia families who view Harlem as their next gold mine. And by the morning of October 18th, every professional killer, two-bit hustler, and desperate gunman in New York understood one thing. Whoever brought Bumpy Johnson's body to Dutch Schultz would walk away richer than a small-town mayor, yet within 6 days, Dutch Schultz himself would be dead, shot to pieces in a New Jersey chophouse, and Bumpy Johnson would walk Harlem's streets untouched for another 30 years. This is the story of the bounty that paralyzed Underworld New York, the racial and territorial battle lines that made collection impossible, and the week that proved some men cannot be bought and some vendettas cannot be survived. This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, and widely circulated accounts. Some details vary across sources. The spark ignited on October 12, 1935, inside the back room of a brownstone on West 137th Street. Dutch Schultz arrived unannounced, a breach of protocol that immediately set teeth on edge. He came with 2 bodyguards and an ultimatum. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries connected to Lucky Luciano's organization, ostensibly to discuss territorial boundaries in Harlem's policy racket. Schultz had been muscling into the neighborhood for 18 months, buying up policy banks, intimidating independent operators, and demanding percentages from street runners who had operated autonomously for years. But the incursion had hit a wall. That wall was Bumpy Johnson. Johnson was present at the meeting, standing quietly beside Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as Queenie or Madame St. Clair, the French Caribbean woman who had built the neighborhood's numbers empire from nothing. Accounts from those present passed down through law enforcement interviews and underworld memoirs describe Schultz as agitated, sweating despite the cool autumn air, his voice rising as he laid out his terms. He wanted 50% of all Harlem policy proceeds. He wanted Johnson removed from enforcement duties. He wanted Madame St. Clair to step aside entirely. In exchange, he offered protection, from whom he did not specify, since the primary threat to Harlem's operators was Schultz himself. Madame St. Clair, according to later testimony, said nothing. She simply looked at Bumpy Johnson. Johnson, a man whose physical presence had earned him his nickname, a prominent bump on the back of his skull, the result of a childhood injury, stepped forward. His response was 2 sentences, delivered without raised voice. Witnesses recalled the exact phrasing, repeated in federal hearings years later: Harlem's policy belongs to Harlem. You're not welcome here. Schultz stood, his face flushed crimson. He pointed directly at Johnson and, in front of a half-dozen witnesses, issued the threat that would define the next week of New York's criminal history. I'll put 50 grand on your head. $50,000 to the man who brings me proof you're dead. By next Sunday, you'll be gone, and I'll own every policy slip in this neighborhood. Johnson reportedly smiled. That smile, cold, unwavering, became part of Harlem legend. He said nothing further. Schultz stormed out, his bodyguards trailing. The meeting lasted less than 12 minutes. Within 2 hours, word of the bounty had spread from the Bronx to Brooklyn. $50,000, an unimaginable sum. The average American worker earned $1,200 a year. A Harlem apartment cost $18 a month. For $50,000, a man could vanish to South America and live like royalty for the rest of his life. Every contract killer, every desperate gambler drowning in debt, every ambitious young hood looking to make a name, they all heard the same number, and they all knew where Bumpy Johnson could be found. He walked the same streets every day, ate at the same diners, drank at the same clubs. He was not hiding. The question racing through the underworld was simple and terrifying. Why? Saturday, October 12th, -9:45 p.m., less than 6 hours after the bounty announcement, the first attempt is made. A gunman identified in police reports only as Vincent C., a freelance enforcer with ties to Schultz's organization, approaches Johnson outside the Rhythm Club on 132nd Street. He draws a .38 revolver at a distance of approximately 15 feet. Before he can fire, 2 shots ring out from a second-story window across the street. Vincent C. falls, struck in the shoulder and thigh. He survives but refuses to cooperate with investigators. The shooter is never identified. Witnesses describe seeing Johnson calmly step over the wounded man and continue walking. No arrest is made. The message is immediate: Bumpy Johnson is protected, and the protection is lethal. Sunday, October 13th, -2:30 a.m., a second crew, 3 men in a stolen Packard, stakes out Johnson's known residence on Edgecombe Avenue. They wait for 4 hours. Johnson never arrives. Later interviews suggest he spent the night moving between safe houses, staying no more than 90 minutes in any location. The crew, frustrated and exposed, abandons the attempt by sunrise. One member later tells federal agents he received a phone call that morning, an unknown voice informing him that his mother's address was now known. He leaves New York within 24 hours. Sunday, October 13th, -11 a.m., reports surface that Lucky Luciano, the most powerful Italian mobster in New York, has called an emergency meeting of the Commission, the governing body of organized crime families. The agenda: Dutch Schultz. Luciano has been feuding with Schultz for months over the latter's reckless behavior, including a public campaign to assassinate Thomas E. Dewey, the crusading district attorney targeting organized crime. The bounty on Bumpy Johnson is viewed not as a business move, but as another example of Schultz's dangerous unpredictability. According to later testimony from informants, Luciano makes his position clear: Harlem is under Italian protection, Bumpy Johnson is an ally, and anyone who touches him answers to the 5 families. The word goes out through channels. The $50,000 bounty is still active, but collecting it now means war with the entire Italian mafia structure. The calculus shifts. Suddenly, the price is not just $50,000, it is your life and the lives of everyone you know. Monday, October 14th, -6:15 p.m. Dutch Schultz meets with his inner circle at a warehouse in the Bronx. Witnesses later describe him as enraged, pacing, smashing bottles against the wall. He has heard about Luciano's decree. He calls it a betrayal. Schultz had worked alongside the Italians for years, paid tribute, honored agreements. Now, over one man, a man he describes using a racial slur recorded in police surveillance transcripts, the commission sides against him. He doubles the bounty, $100,000. The message is broadcast through every bar, every backroom card game, every street corner where criminals gather. The number is almost abstract now, almost mythical. But the effect is not escalation. It is paralysis. No professional killer wants to take a contract that puts them at odds with Lucky Luciano. The bounty becomes a symbol of Schultz's isolation, not his power. Tuesday, October 15th morning, Bumpy Johnson appears in public at the Savoy Ballroom during daylight hours, surrounded by a crowd of Harlem residents. Journalists later note the scene: Johnson moving freely, shaking hands, laughing. The optics are deliberate. He is demonstrating that he is not afraid, that he is not hiding, and most critically, that the neighborhood stands with him. No attempt is made on his life. Police observe from a distance but do not intervene. One detective later writes in his report, "Subject appears protected by both organized criminal elements and civilian population. Surveillance suspended due to hostile crowd conditions." Wednesday, October 16th evening, word reaches Schultz that no progress has been made. Not a single credible crew has taken the contract. His rage metastasizes into paranoia. He begins to suspect betrayal within his own ranks, questioning his lieutenants, threatening associates. His organization, already strained by legal pressure and internal dissent, begins to fracture. Two of his top earners quietly reach out to Luciano's people, seeking assurances that switching sides will be forgiven. The mafia does not forgive easily, but it recognizes opportunity. Schultz is becoming a liability, not just to his enemies, but to his allies. Thursday, October 17th afternoon, Thomas Dewey's office issues subpoenas for Dutch Schultz and 3 of his accountants. The legal net is tightening. Schultz, already consumed by the Harlem conflict, now faces the existential threat of prosecution and prison. Associates later report that he spoke obsessively about killing Dewey, believing that eliminating the prosecutor would end his legal troubles. Luciano hears these plans and makes a decision. Later testimony and historical analysis suggest this is the moment when Dutch Schultz's fate is sealed. The commission cannot allow the murder of a district attorney. It would bring federal heat that could destroy organized crime in New York for a generation. Schultz must be stopped. Friday, October 18th, late evening, Dutch Schultz dines at the Palace Chophouse in Newark, New Jersey, a restaurant he frequents. He is with 3 associates. At approximately 10:15 p.m., 2 gunmen enter. They are methodical. 4 men are shot. Schultz is hit in the abdomen. He will linger in the hospital for 22 hours before dying on October 24th, delirious and incoherent. His final words a rambling, fevered monologue recorded by police stenographers. Bumpy Johnson is in Harlem when the news breaks. He makes no public comment. The bounty dies with its author. Side A, Dutch Schultz and the Bronx beer baron Arthur Flegenheimer was born in the Bronx in 1901, the son of German-Jewish immigrants. He took the name Dutch Schultz early in his criminal career, reportedly because it sounded tougher than his given name, more suited to the streets where he made his living. He began as a burglar and street brawler, served time on Blackwell's Island, and emerged during Prohibition with a singular focus: beer. While other mobsters fought over liquor importation and speakeasies, Schultz built a beer distribution empire across the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, using a combination of competitive pricing and savage violence. Rival beer distributors were beaten, their trucks overturned, their drivers hospitalized. Saloon owners who refused to buy Schultz's product found their establishments bombed or vandalized. By 1933, Schultz controlled an estimated 70% of the Bronx beer market, generating millions annually. But Prohibition's repeal that same year threatened his livelihood. Legal breweries returned. Schultz pivoted immediately to the policy racket, the numbers game that had thrived in black neighborhoods for decades. The game was simple. Players bet small amounts, often a nickel or a dime, on a 3-digit number. If their number matched the daily winning number, typically derived from stock exchange figures or horse racing results, they won at odds of 600 to 1. The margins were favorable for operators, the volume enormous, and the clientele loyal. Harlem's policy banks moved $40,000 a day through their systems, a staggering sum in the depths of the Great Depression. Schultz saw an industry ripe for consolidation. His method was straightforward: approach independent policy operators with an offer to protect them for a percentage of their take. Those who refused found their runners arrested, their policy slips confiscated, their collection men hospitalized. Schultz had cultivated relationships within the police department, paying protection money to precinct captains who ensured that competitors faced harassment while Schultz's operations ran smoothly. Within 18 months, he had absorbed dozens of Harlem policy banks, consolidating them under his control and extracting millions annually. But Stephanie St. Clair and her network, protected by Bumpy Johnson's enforcement and increasingly by the Italian mafia's strategic interest, refused to fold. Schultz's reputation was built on volatility. He was known to shoot associates on suspicion of disloyalty, to fly into rages over trivial slights, to make decisions based on paranoia rather than strategy. This unpredictability made him dangerous, but it also made him unreliable. By 1935, even his allies viewed him with suspicion. His obsession with killing District Attorney Thomas Dewey, a man who had indicted Schultz on tax evasion charges and was methodically dismantling his empire, alarmed the commission. Lucky Luciano and the other mafia leaders understood that assassinating a prosecutor would bring federal wrath, that no amount of bribery could mitigate. Schultz's refusal to back down from that plan, combined with his reckless Harlem campaign, marked him as a threat not just to his enemies, but to the stability of organized crime itself. Side B: Bumpy Johnson and the Harlem Kingdom. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. He arrived in Harlem as a teenager, part of the Great Migration that brought hundreds of thousands of black Southerners north in search of work and escape from Jim Crow terror. Harlem in the 1920s was a world unto itself, culturally vibrant, economically dynamic, and largely autonomous from the white power structures that governed the rest of New York. It was also a place where survival often required strength, and Johnson quickly proved he possessed it in abundance. His nickname came from a childhood injury, but it became synonymous with toughness. By his mid-20s, Johnson had established himself as an enforcer for Stephanie St. Clair, the brilliant and ruthless French Caribbean immigrant who controlled Harlem's most lucrative policy banks. St. Clair, known as Queenie, was one of the few women to wield genuine power in the criminal underworld. She was educated, multilingual, and strategic, understanding that Harlem's numbers game was not just a racket, but an economic institution that kept money circulating within the black community during a time when banks refused loans and legitimate businesses discriminated in hiring. She needed someone who could protect that institution with force, and Bumpy Johnson became that person. Johnson was not merely a strong man. He was known for discipline, for keeping his word, and for a kind of rough integrity that earned respect even from those who opposed him. He did not rob ordinary residents. He did not cheat the policy players. He did not prey on the weak. His violence was targeted, professional, and by the standards of the underworld measured. When Dutch Schultz men began shaking down Harlem policy operators, Johnson responded with precision. Schultz enforcers were beaten, their operations disrupted, their collections intercepted. The message was clear: Harlem's policy racket was not for sale. By the mid-1930s, Johnson had also cultivated a crucial alliance: the Italian mafia families, particularly Lucky Luciano's organization. Luciano recognized that controlling Harlem required local expertise and local legitimacy. Rather than impose an occupying force, he partnered with St. Clair and Johnson, offering protection and capital in exchange for a share of the profits. This arrangement gave Johnson access to resources and firepower that Schultz, despite his wealth, could not match. When Schultz placed the bounty, he was not merely targeting one man. He was challenging an alliance that spanned the entire New York underworld. Johnson's survival during the bounty week was not luck. It was the result of strategic relationships, community support, and the implicit threat that killing him would trigger a war nobody wanted. Harlem's residents saw him as a protector, a figure who kept external predators at bay. The Italian families saw him as a valuable partner, someone who maintained order and profitability without drawing excessive law enforcement attention. Even some within Schultz's own organization quietly admired Johnson's defiance. To collect the bounty would mean betraying not just an individual, but an entire network of interests and loyalties. The $50,000 later, doubled to $100,000, was meaningless if the cost of collecting it was your own destruction. That calculation, made independently by dozens of potential killers, is why Bumpy Johnson lived and Dutch Schultz did not. The policy racket, known variously as the numbers game, the numbers racket, or simply policy, was the economic heartbeat of Harlem during the Great Depression. To understand why Dutch Schultz was willing to kill for it, and why Bumpy Johnson was willing to die defending it, one must understand the staggering sums of money moving through this underground lottery every single day. The game operated on elegant simplicity. A player selected a three-digit number, anything, from 0000 to 999. Bets were placed with runners, street-level collectors who moved through neighborhoods taking wagers as small as a penny or as large as $1. The runners recorded the bets in duplicate books, keeping one copy and delivering the other, along with the collected cash, to a policy bank, the central operation that held the money and paid out winnings. The winning number was determined by a public, ostensibly unmanipulable source, typically the last three digits of the daily total of U.S. Treasury balance figures published in newspapers, or the payoff odds at a specific racetrack. If a player's number hit, the payout was 600 to 1. A nickel bet returned $30. A dollar bet returned $600. For Harlem residents earning $10 or $15 a week, if they were lucky enough to have work at all, the dream of a $30 windfall was intoxicating. The odds were long 1 in 1,000, but the cost was small, and the game was played daily. Hope was cheap and constantly renewable. The economics from the operator's perspective were stunning. Assume a single Harlem policy bank collected $10,000 in bets on a given day, a conservative estimate for an established operation. Mathematical probability dictated that approximately 10 players would hit the winning number, each having bet an average of $1. The bank would owe $6,000 in payouts. That left $4,000 in profit, minus operational costs, paying the runners their commission, typically 10% of collected bets, and bribing police to avoid raids. Even after those expenses, the daily profit margin hovered around 30%. Multiply that across 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, and a well-run Harlem policy bank could generate $250,000 annually. Stephanie St. Clair controlled multiple banks. Dutch Schultz wanted them all. Here is the critical breakdown for a single day across Harlem's estimated policy. Operations in 1935: text times total times daily times bets, times placed, text times expected times payouts, times based, times on times probability, text times gross, times profit times before times expenses, text times runner times commissions times 10 times percent, text times Police times bribes times and times protection. Text times net times daily times profit. Text times annualized times profit. Nearly $4 million a year, generated by nickels and dimes, flowing through a neighborhood where the median household income was under $1,000 annually. This was not a marginal racket. This was an industry. And for the residents of Harlem, it was also an economic lifeline. The policy banks employed hundreds of runners, provided emergency loans when family members fell ill, and kept money circulating within a community that had been systematically excluded from legitimate financial systems. Banks would not lend to black families. Businesses would not hire black workers in proportion to their population. The policy racket was, paradoxically, both exploitative and sustaining. Dutch Schultz saw only the profit. He approached the numbers game as he had approached beer distribution, as a commodity to be monopolized through violence and efficiency. Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair understood it as something more, a community institution that, if controlled by an outsider indifferent to Harlem's welfare, could be strip-mined for profit and discarded. That ideological divide, as much as the money itself, explains why the conflict turned lethal. The New York Police Department's response to the bounty and the escalating underworld tension was, by all accounts, minimal and compromised. The 32nd Precinct, which covered much of Harlem, was well aware of both Dutch Schultz's incursion and the subsequent attempts on Bumpy Johnson's life. Patrol reports from the week of October 12th through 18th document the shooting of Vincent C., the suspicious presence of armed men outside known policy, banks, and increased complaints from residents about gangster activity. Yet no arrests were made in connection with the bounty, and no protective measures were extended to Johnson, despite his status as the target of a widely publicized murder contract. The reason was institutional corruption. Dutch Schultz had been paying police protection money for years, funneling thousands of dollars monthly to precinct captains and high-ranking officers who ensured that raids on his operations were telegraphed in advance and that competing policy banks faced harassment while his ran smoothly. But Schultz's influence was not absolute. The Italian mafia, particularly through Lucky Luciano's network, had cultivated its own police contacts, often at higher levels of the department and city government. The result was a paralyzed law enforcement apparatus, unwilling or unable to intervene in what was understood as an internal underworld matter. Officers on the street saw the violence, documented it in perfunctory reports, and moved on. District Attorney Thomas Dewey's office, by contrast, was acutely aware of the situation, but Dewey's focus was on building tax evasion and racketeering cases against Schultz, not on intervening in gang disputes. Dewey had no love for any of the parties involved. He viewed Johnson, Schultz, and the Italian mafia as equal threats to the rule of law. His strategy was patient and procedural: gather evidence, secure indictments, and dismantle the organizations through the courts. The immediate threat to Bumpy Johnson's life was not, in Dewey's calculus, a prosecutorial priority. The Harlem community's response was more complex and more consequential. For many residents, Bumpy Johnson was a figure of respect, even admiration. He did not prey on ordinary citizens. He kept more dangerous criminal elements, stick-up men, burglars, sexual predators out of the neighborhood through intimidation and violence. He ensured that the policy game was run fairly, that winners were paid, that runners did not cheat players. In a community systematically neglected and abused by the legitimate power structures of New York, Johnson represented a form of rough justice and protection. When word spread that Dutch Schultz had placed a bounty on him, the reaction was not indifference but solidarity. Witnesses from that week describe residents actively shielding Johnson. When he walked the streets, crowds formed around him, making a clear shot impossible. When suspicious cars appeared, word spread through the neighborhood within minutes, and Johnson was warned. Safe houses were provided by families who risked retribution. This was not mere criminal loyalty, it was a community recognizing that Schultz's takeover would mean exploitation by an outsider who cared nothing for Harlem's welfare. The residents chose their devil. They chose the one who, for all his violence, lived among them and understood the unwritten rules. That choice kept Bumpy Johnson alive. Scenario 1. Retreat Dutch Schultz withdraws the bounty, publicly or quietly, and abandons his Harlem incursion. This scenario requires Schultz to accept humiliation, a nearly impossible ask for a man whose reputation is built on fear and dominance. If he retreats, he signals weakness to every policy operator, every street crew, every ambitious rival. His existing empire begins to crumble as subordinates question his authority. The financial cost is immediate. He forfeits millions in potential Harlem revenue. The psychological cost is worse. Schultz's volatility makes retreat unlikely. His pride will not permit it. This scenario is plausible only if the Commission intervenes directly, ordering him to back down. But by October 1935, the Commission is already discussing a more permanent solution. Retreat is the least violent option, but also the least likely. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement. A sit-down is arranged, mediated by Lucky Luciano or another Commission member. Schultz receives a token. Share of Harlem policy revenue enough to save face, but not enough to dominate. Bumpy Johnson and Stephanie St. Clair retain operational control. This scenario requires all parties to compromise, and compromise requires trust. Schultz has already demonstrated recklessness with the bounty and his threats against District Attorney Dewey. The Commission does not trust him to honor agreements. Johnson, backed by community support and Italian firepower, has no incentive to negotiate from a position of strength. The costs of negotiation include ongoing tension, the likelihood of future betrayals, and the precedent that violence can be bargained away. This scenario is theoretically possible but practically unstable. It delays the inevitable rather than resolving it. Scenario 3. All-out escalation. The violence intensifies. Schultz, enraged by his inability to collect the bounty, escalates to bombings, targeting policy banks directly and accepting civilian casualties. Johnson and the Italian families respond with coordinated hits on Schultz's operations, his lieutenants, his revenue streams. The conflict spills beyond Harlem into the Bronx and Manhattan, drawing police crackdowns that hurt all parties. The cost in lives is significant, a dozen or more deaths within weeks. The economic cost is equally severe. Law enforcement pressure disrupts all policy operations, liquor distribution, loan sharking, and gambling enterprises across the city. Legitimate businesses suffer as violence drives customers away. The Commission, facing existential threat to its operations, makes the ultimate decision: Dutch Schultz must be eliminated. This scenario ends not with Johnson's death but with Schultz, which is precisely what happens on October 23, 1935. Within hours of Dutch Schultz's shooting at the Palace Chophouse, new information reaches law enforcement and underworld networks that shifts the entire calculus of New York's criminal landscape. Two of Schultz's most trusted lieutenants, men who controlled his policy operations in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, have disappeared. Their whereabouts are unknown. Their absence is interpreted as either flight or death. If they fled, it suggests they had advanced knowledge of the hit and chose survival over loyalty. If they were killed, it signals that the Commission's purge is broader than a single target. Simultaneously, Lucky Luciano's organization moves with remarkable speed to absorb Schultz's territory. By the morning of October 24th, Italian mafia representatives are meeting with Schultz's former subordinates, offering them a choice: continue operating under new management or face the same fate as their boss. Most choose continuation. The transition is nearly seamless, a demonstration of planning and coordination that could only result from advanced preparation. The bounty on Bumpy Johnson is formally rescinded, not through public announcement, but through the simple cessation of attempts on his life. Johnson emerges from the week not merely alive but elevated. His defiance, his survival, and his alliance with the Italian families position him as the undisputed power in Harlem's criminal economy. Thomas Dewey's office releases a terse statement expressing satisfaction that one of their primary targets is no longer a threat, though they pointedly note that the criminal enterprises Schultz controlled have not disappeared, merely changed hands. The federal government begins to take notice. The seamless execution of the Schultz hit and the rapid consolidation of territory reveal a level of organization and sophistication that will eventually lead to the RICO statutes decades later. October 24, 1935, 22 hours after being shot, Dutch Schultz dies in the hospital, his final words a delirious rambling recorded by police stenographers' phrases about French-Canadian bean soup, harmony, and a girl named Flo. The transcripts will be analyzed for decades, parsed for hidden meanings or deathbed confessions. They reveal nothing. A man who lived by violence dies incoherent, his empire already divided among his enemies before his heart stops. Bumpy Johnson stands on the corner of 135th and Lenox Avenue that evening. Witnesses describe him as calm, smoking a cigarette, greeting neighbors as though the previous 12 days never happened. The bounty that paralyzed New York's underworld, that exposed the fractures within organized crime, that proved the limits of money as a motivator, it ends not with a collection, but with the death of the man who issued it. No one ever claimed the $50,000, later doubled to $100,000. The reason is now undeniable. Some men cannot be killed because the systems protecting them are stronger than any individual's will to murder. The question haunting the city as the week closes is not why the bounty failed, but what comes next. Harlem's policy racket is now firmly under Italian mafia control, with Bumpy Johnson as its street-level czar. Schultz's former territories are being carved up in backroom meetings. Thomas Dewey sharpens his prosecutorial tools, knowing that eliminating one gangster has only strengthened the organization behind him. And in the tenements and nightclubs of Harlem, ordinary residents calculate what the new order will cost them. By Sunday, October 27th, the streets will tell the story. The city waits.